We do have a Bible reading this morning from Matt, who will be talking to us later. Firstly, from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honourable we treat with special honour, and the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honour to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honoured, every part rejoices with it. And now from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you.
Morning all. Once again, happy Mother's Day. My name is Matt and I'm one of the leaders here at MCC, and again it's fantastic to have you join us on this sunny and joyous Sunday morning. As you've probably already heard, I'm going to be speaking on about Mother's Day, given the occasion. And I should say off the bat, I feel a little bit, you couldn't really say that I'm overqualified to talk on this. I've had zero direct experience in terms of being a mother. I can't really bring that to the table. I was thinking about what kind of qualifies me to be up here talking about it. Maybe I've experienced vicarious motherhood. I've been on the receiving end of motherhood, and that's been good. But safe to say, I'm a big fan. So hopefully that helps. I'm a really, really, really big fan of motherhood. So I'm very, very happy to be talking about it. But given all that, I don't want to be focusing just on mothers this morning. So I'm not going to be talking about just mothers. Instead, I want to look at what they represent and point to, if you like. What they represent and point to. I think that there are at least 3 qualities that we often associate with ideal motherhood. And I think you can say that these 3 qualities actually point towards God. And maybe they even point to the church when the church is operating as it should, at its best. So this morning, I'm keen to look at these 3 qualities that we often associate with motherhood, and I want to celebrate them as well. But before we go much further, it's worth mentioning that the experiences that we have with our respective mothers and the experiences that mothers have of being mothers is varied and broad. So obviously it goes without saying, but just in case, there's no perfect mother. There's probably, and hopefully, no kind of completely or very few completely diabolical mothers as well. Some people, as we've already heard this morning, have great relationships with their mums. Some have really difficult relationships with their mums. And the fact of life is that often it can change, right? Like that relationship is not a static thing, it's a dynamic thing. Maybe most are in between those 2 extremes. For some, maybe most, this is a happy day. For others, it can be understandably difficult, and it's worth naming that up. Maybe you've got a less than ideal relationship with your mum. Maybe your mum has passed and you're still mourning her. I don't know. But this diversity of experience when it comes to mothers is a fact of life, and I think we see it in art, and I think we see it in history. You've got like two examples of the extremes. For those of you who have seen The Sopranos, watch the classic TV show The Sopranos. You've got Tony Soprano here, the classic alpha male mafia boss in the series. He's the richest, toughest, most powerful and imposing guy in the room. But who's the one person in his world who can still reduce him to a nervous, petulant and self-doubting little boy? It's his elderly and infirm mother. She knows exactly what buttons to press, and he's still desperately trying to earn her love and is terrified of her disappointment. So that's one extreme. On the other, you've got the French philosopher and author Albert Camus. So he wasn't, I think, particularly renowned for being sentimental or traditional or really upbeat. I think this is a picture of him and his mum. It was hard to tell because the image was in French, but I think we'll just assume for the sake of the exercise that that's his mum. When he was receiving a Nobel Prize for Literature back in the 50s, so he's like literally mid-ceremony of receiving this prestigious award, he was publicly derided. A protester got up and shouted him down for not supporting the independence of his home country of Algeria. Again, this is back in the 50s, I believe. The groups that had been campaigning for the independence of Algeria back then had resorted to things like bombing. And they expected Camus, given his position and his prestige and his writings, to promote their cause. And this is what he went on later to say. This is his explanation of why he didn't support their activities. I must condemn a terrorism that works blindly in the streets of Algiers and one day may strike at my mother and my family. I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice. So, Tony Soprano as one extreme, Camus on the other. All this to say that it can be complicated, and I don't want to generalise, which again is why I'm not looking at mothers exclusively, but more what they ideally point to and represent. So 3 qualities I think that we associate with good mums that also point to Jesus and the church, again when the church is operating well. We've got voluntary weakness and self-sacrifice. We've got dedication to the welfare of those in their care. And thirdly, we've got the reality of dependence. So first of all, voluntary weakness and self-sacrifice. I still like to joke, and the emphasis on there is joke, that when Louis was giving birth to Hudson, our eldest, I had the tougher gig for sure. Usually about 50% of the audience laugh at that when I tell it or mention it. They may be male, they may all be male. I was fully conscious and present to what was occurring and had no pharmaceutical intervention to help take the edge off. So the whole thing is still burned and etched into my memory. But of course, that's ridiculous. No one suffers for their kids like a mother. Carrying a baby for 9 months must be an amazing experience in terms of bonding and connection. And I can't even begin to really fathom it. But it also has elements of voluntary weakness and self-sacrifice. If you're carrying a baby, your body is no longer working as optimally compared to pre-pregnancy. You're both physically and emotionally vulnerable. And then there's the actual labour, which some people may never be quite the same after. And then there's the feeding that comes with having babies and the sleep deprivation. And any mum may make the professional sacrifices as well. Any career that you had before will, at the very least, not be quite on the same trajectory after. And then there's the ongoing worry and concern that you have for your children that, as far as I know, doesn't stop when they become adults either. Like the nature of the worries and the concerns just change. They say to love is to suffer. That's not all it is, but it certainly involves its fair share of suffering. And it makes one weak in the sense that to love something necessitates giving up your former degree of independence and emotional invulnerability. And mostly these days, not always, but mostly these days, this weakness is something that parents voluntarily take on and find well worth it. But it's always risky and it's always costly. And I'd argue, as a big generalisation, even more so for mothers than for fathers. This risky, self-sacrificial love that involves voluntary weakness, it's typically associated with ideal motherhood. And this is one of the qualities that we value when we celebrate today. And it's also one of the qualities that reflects the very nature of God. Maybe you could say that this is an example, if you like, of motherhood actually reflecting the image of God. Fathers also get a look in, of course. One classic example is that of the prodigal son. So the father figure here, representing God, after voluntarily weakening himself by giving his son his inheritance whilst he's still alive, he then faithfully waits, eagerly hoping for his ungrateful son's return. That would have involved a loss of face in the culture of the day. And then, when he sees his son on the road, out in the distance, he lifts his robes and runs to meet him with open arms, which just would have been a horribly undignified act back then. One that would have cost the father some social status in the eyes of his peers. He would have lost respect doing such an undignified thing as running down the road to greet his scoundrel of a son. This is a picture of what God has done for us. The pinnacle being Jesus, the Son of God, stooping down and voluntarily becoming human, as we've already heard this morning, weakening himself, making himself put aside all the deserved glory of being God. And as we read in the Gospels, weeping for the suffering of his friends, hearing that his dear friend Lazarus is dead and weeping when he sees the grief of the other people around that and experiences it himself. That's some vulnerability. And then, as we've also heard this morning, enduring an unjust death. So we have the classic passage from Philippians. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So these traits of, again, motherhood, laying aside equality, making yourself nothing, humbling yourself for the sake of people who you love, they are small pointers to the very nature of God and his grace. Now, the second quality that I want to touch on is related to this, but it's slightly different. It's the care that mothers have for their children's welfare. So they're not just self-sacrificial and vulnerable for the sake of it, but because they want to see their children protected from harm and to grow and to thrive. And again, ideal motherhood involves mothers being willing to endure anything for that. They will go through and suffer anything for that cause. I came across this snippet from a poem called Burning Girl, and it's a really evocative description of the love and concern that mothers have when their kids suffer and just how far they'll go for them. So it goes, she being the daughter, was an almost ghost her mother saw, erasing the edges of herself each day, smudging the lines like charcoal while her parents redrew her secretly into being over and again each night and dawn and sleepless all years long. Having seen that mother's love, I testify, it was an endless ocean. One drop could have brought back to life the deadest Christ. Sleepless and spent, day after day, for the sake of redrawing your child back into being. Day after day, after for one reason or another they've been erasing the better parts of themselves. Being willing to suffer for the sake of seeing those you care about become who you know they can be. That's some potent motherhood right there. And funnily enough, this is similar to the kind of ideal love and concern the Scripture holds up as a standard for how mature Christians, so those who have been following Jesus for a while, and leaders, Christian leaders, should be treating those newer to our faith. So going back to that passage that Helen read out before, look at how the Apostle Paul, a leader of the early church, he describes the way that he and his peers acted amongst new Christians in the church at Thessalonica. He wrote, "Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you, because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you." So just check out that analogy. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children. This isn't a symmetrical relationship where both parties are giving to each other equally. It's not like that. It's not an equal scratching of backs that Paul is describing here as being the ideal relationship between mature Christians and those younger to the faith. Out of love, he writes, experienced Christians will gladly share their lives, their entire lives, with newer ones, and will work, suffer, sacrifice, so not to get in the way of those newer Christians maturing. But even more than that, they'll do all those things to help those younger Christians grow. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that this is the norm, if you like, or it's common, but it's still a mother-like ideal that we, particularly us who are more experienced, mature Christians, that we should be striving for. And again, it's something that we see mirrored when it comes to motherhood, ideal motherhood. And speaking of ideals, I'll turn now to the last quality that I think motherhood points to, and that is dependency, the quality of dependency. Some of you would be familiar with this guy, David Goggins. He's an American guy, probably a contender for the world's most toughest human. So, amongst other things, he's famous for completing the infamous Hell Week for US Navy SEAL training, so the elite special forces in the States. It involves being kept up, not out of choice, but kept up for literally 4 days straight and made to go through all these horrendous exercises. So he's done that 2.5 times. And one of those times involved running every day on literally broken legs that he strapped up with gaffer tape and a bunch of other stuff. He's also an ultra-marathon runner. He's got the current world record for doing the most pull-ups in 24 hours. That's 4,000 plus if anyone's thinking about having a go at taking that from him. And he did most of these things whilst having an unknown, as in he didn't know about it, an undiagnosed congenital heart condition, which meant that he was always operating on less oxygen than a typical person. So he is a stereotypical tough guy. But when he tells his story, he's written a couple of books, of course, he always credits his mother for being the man he is today. His mother saved him. She had the courage to flee an incredibly abusive father and context of domestic violence. And then she worked tirelessly to put her son through school and was constantly by his side, cheering him on throughout his many achievements. And she was by his side when no one else was at all. By his own admission, even one of the toughest guys in the world couldn't have gotten by without his mum. And that's almost all of us, if not all of us, I'd suggest, in this room, right? As much as it can stick in our throats at times, as much as we still love the ideal, or at least part of us does, the ideal of being the self-made person. And as much as our relationships with our mothers may have deteriorated, we're still dependent upon our parents, particularly our mothers or some other parental figure, for a decent chunk of our lives. And I'm not talking about just the obvious senses of food and shelter, etc., but also things like values, attitudes, what we love, our tastes, all that stuff. None of us have reached maturity as completely blank slates. We've been shaped in all these many ways by our parents, by our caregivers. And in that regard, we've all at least been dependent on someone else sometime in our lives. Now, this of course can go wrong. If dads can be notorious for being distant or absent, mothers can be guilty of smothering. St. Augustine, one of the heroes of the early church back in the 400s, he had, safe to say, he's the one with the beard, by the way, he had a complicated relationship with his mother, Monica, as a young man. So much so that he took his family and he fled the continent. He literally left not just the country, but the continent that he shared with his mum without telling her. She found out and pursued them, like turning up at the same city and going to the same church, and embarrassing him with her rustic and simplistic faith. That's what he thought in his eyes. Maybe that's a good example of smothering, being willing to cross continents. That's one extreme. On the other hand, we can feel deserted at times, or maybe disappointed by our mothers. Where were you? I needed you and you weren't there. All that kind of stuff. This is a good day to remind ourselves that mothers are only human. There are no perfect mothers, just like there are no perfect children. And as well as a day of gratitude, this is a good chance to practice grace, self-awareness, and forgiveness. But regardless of how ideal this relationship between mother and child is or isn't, chances are we were all dependent upon them sometime. And again, it's worth pointing out, as I did before, that the relationship that we have with our parents can be dynamic. Going back to Augustine here, not long after she joined him again and ended up in the same church, he realised through God's grace just how much he owed her. And they were reconciled, became incredibly close. I think they were, well, I know Augustine was sainted. I think Monica was sainted by the Catholic Church as well. I think someone who will be able to tell me afterwards, Santa Monica is named after her, right? Santa Monica, yeah. So again, that changed. It went from being over here to completely the other end of the spectrum in terms of being close. And again, this quality of dependence is something we see etched into how we go about being church. So Helen read out this famous passage. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honourable, we treat with special honour. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty. While our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honour to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honoured, every part rejoices with it. So we need each other in the church. And I'd argue that's a form of interdependency. If one part suffers or rejoices, so do the others. And that's also got to be a form of interdependency as well. It seems to be a case of even our emotions, or at least our emotional state to some degree, is linked to the people either side of us. Just like in the mother-child relationship, there's always risk of feeling smothered or feeling let down by the church. But it doesn't change the fact that we're still interdependent. Not independent, but interdependent. You and I and everyone else who is part of this church is responsible in some important way for each other's discipleship. And that's not optional. That's not something that we opt into. That's instead how we created, how we built. So mothers are special. They play these important and irreplaceable roles in our lives. And there are particular qualities that we associate with motherhood when it's working well, when it's ideal and good. Again, self-sacrifice, concern for those whom are in their charge, and the reality of our dependence and interdependence. And motherhood is part of God's good creation. I was only, thinking, well, this only kind of came to me the other day, I guess, but motherhood came about before what Christians often refer to as the fall, if you like, the entry of sin in the world. Motherhood was around before that. When God gave Adam and Eve and the animals the command to fill the earth, that's got to imply motherhood, right? That's got to imply motherhood. So God created it, and he said it was good. In and of itself, it's a glorious thing. It's innately good. It's not just good because of the social function that it plays. It's not good just for pragmatic reasons. And it's not just good because it points to God. God said motherhood is good. So take some comfort and encouragement from that, mums. But again, all of these qualities also point beyond motherhood itself to both God and the church. So it's worth considering, again, that motherhood can actually point to God, like all creation. It can lead to God being praised and glorified. Maybe you could even say that the mothers, like you mums amongst us, you're a signpost, if you like, a very signpost to God, to his forgiveness, to his goodness and his self-sacrificial love for us. So thank you and happy Mother's Day, and let's pray. Father, once again, I thank you for mothers. I thank you that more often than not, they are so willing to go above and beyond. They are self-sacrificial. They make themselves vulnerable for the sake of their children. I thank you so much for that. And I also thank you that, that we've got a day where we can, acknowledge that and focus on that primarily. And I thank you most of all that these qualities that you've associated, that you've built in to ideal motherhood, that they also point to you and they remind us of the kind of God that you are. So I thank you for that. I pray that we'll take comfort and encouragement from that. And I pray particularly this morning you'll be with all the mothers here and continue to bless them and continue just to help them keep on loving the people the way that you want us to. Amen.